Before all this began, I often found solace under the vast, open sky. As a child growing up in a quiet, unremarkable town, I would spend hours on the old wooden swing in our backyard, looking up at the stars and wondering what lay beyond the mundane world I knew. Those moments of wonder shaped me, planting a restless spirit that eventually drew me to the military. It wasn't a love for war, but a need to understand human resilience, to measure my courage against the chaos of the world. Years later, that same sky seemed both smaller and infinitely more complex. My path had taken me to distant places, harsh deserts, foreign lands, and battlefields where the stakes were life or death. Each mission carried its weight, but there was an odd comfort in the camaraderie we built, the unspoken bonds forged in fire. Even amid the chaos, there was a strange kind of order, a rhythm that only those who'd been there could truly understand. The sun dipped below the horizon in Kabul like it always did, somber yet striking, casting the rugged peaks in shades of crimson and gold, as if the earth itself mourned the fallen. I stood on the rooftop of our compound that evening, the night before everything unraveled. It was my habit, 5 minutes of solitude away from the team. They didn't make a fuss about it. Just Butch being Butch, they'd say, brushing it off. But I needed that quiet, though it could never silence the echoes of past missions. That evening, my team was in high spirits. Dan was proudly showing off photos of his newborn daughter, just 3 weeks old. "She got my ears," he chuckled. "Poor kid." Mikey and Jonesy were locked in a heated debate over some cheesy movie they'd seen on a bootleg DVD, while Doc sat off to the side, penning a letter to his wife. Their laughter still rings in my mind, a bitter reminder of the chaos and screams that would come less than a day later. The mission was straightforward, too straightforward, a routine sweep to gather intel on a high-value individual rumored to be hiding in a village we'd been through countless times before. I should have noticed the red flags, the unusual way the villagers dispersed early, the absence of children kicking a soccer ball in the dirt. But exhaustion had dulled our senses. Complacency had snuck in unnoticed, and in our line of work, that kind of carelessness could be fatal. We were midway through the village when the first blast shattered the air, an IED concealed beneath a pile of debris. Mikey and Jonesy were taken down immediately. Before the dust even settled, chaos erupted from every direction. It was an ambush. We retaliated. It was what we trained for. But they had the upper hand. Elevated positions, superior numbers, and precise knowledge of our plans. They knew our routes, our timing, everything. Each move we made was countered with unrelenting precision. Dan was hit in the chest as he tried to drag Mikey to safety. Doc kept working on him, even as debris tore through his leg. He passed away next to Dan, his hands still clutching bandages he never got to use. I don't recall when I was wounded. The chaos blurred everything: smoke, chaos, pain. I collapsed behind a crumbling wall, clutching my side where crimson poured like a broken faucet. They left me, assuming I wouldn't make it. Healing wasn't just about my body. The physical wounds patched up quicker than the turmoil brewing in my head. Weeks passed in that cold, clinical hospital bed while I replayed every choice, every move, questioning what I could have done differently. They called it survivor's guilt. Fancy term, but I didn't need jargon to tell me I was wrecked inside. By the time I was released, I'd already made my decision. I handed in my resignation. The Army didn't make it easy. My commanding officer pulled me aside, laid out all the right words. "You're a hero, Foster. We still need men like you." But they didn't get it. The thought of stepping back onto a battlefield without my team, without my brothers, was unbearable. Now I'm back home, stateside. Everything feels off. The streets are too calm, the people too detached. I've traded desert camo for jeans and flannel, the sound of chaos for the steady rumble of a truck's engine. I bought a little house up in the hills away from city noise. Nights are spent on the porch, eyes fixed on the stars, searching for the constellations I remember from Afghanistan. Sometimes I hear echoes, Dan's booming laugh, Mikey's jokes, Doc's steady orders. But they're not real, just fragments of memory, fading faster than I can hold on to them. The real ghost isn't them, it's the silence. A few weeks ago, I found an old team photo stuffed in my gear. All of us grinning ear to ear, arms slung around each other, grime smeared on our faces. I stared at that picture for hours, trying to make peace with what I couldn't undo. In the end, I buried it out back, planting a tree over it. Maybe I thought something new could grow out of all that loss. They say life goes on. Maybe it does. For me, though, it's less about living and more about surviving. Just making it through another day, because that's what they'd want. Because it's all I know. I came home, but the weight of everything followed me like a shadow. And then, one day, everything shifted in an instant. The coffee was bad, burnt, bitter, but it was hot, and it gave me something to hold on to, so I drank it anyway. The cafe was the kind of place with mismatched furniture and overpriced scones where you wonder why you even bother. I came here for the quiet, the kind that didn't feel overwhelming. I sat in a corner, back to the wall, eyes on the door. Old habits die hard. Life outside moved on without me. People walked by, laughing, chatting, living. And then they came in, 3 of them. Something was off immediately. The way their eyes swept the room, sharp and calculating. They weren't here for coffee. I've seen men like that before. Predators. Their movements had a purpose, like wolves circling prey. I followed their gaze to a man in his 60s, well-dressed in a sharp suit, seated by the window. He wasn't alone. 2 bodyguards flanked him, both large and alert, earpieces discreetly tucked away, but not alert enough. The first crack shattered the uneasy calm of the cafe. Chaos erupted. One bodyguard moved fast, but not fast enough. The second hit landed square. The other lunged to shield the man in the suit, collapsing as his Colt skidded across the tiles, toward me. Time slowed. Screams rang out. People scrambled for cover, chairs screeching against the floor. The shooters moved in, tools raised, focused on their target. Instinct kicked in. The fallen pistol was at my feet. I grabbed it and fired. The jolt ran through me, a grim familiarity. My first hit struck the lead assailant squarely. He went down. The second turned, stunned, long enough for me to send another into his side. The third ducked behind a table, lashing out wildly. Wood splinters flew as debris tore through the counter near my head. I crouched low, moving to flank him. My heart thundered, adrenaline cold and sharp, but my hands stayed steady. When I popped up, I acted twice. The first move missed. The second struck his shoulder, spinning him to the ground. His tool clattered away as he cried out. Silence. The acrid smell of gunpowder lingered. I stood there, pistol still raised, scanning for threats. The old man was alive, untouched, staring at me with an unreadable expression. His remaining bodyguard bled out on the floor. Slowly, people emerged from under tables, their faces a mix of fear and awe. Someone whispered, "He saved us." I didn't feel like a hero. My ears rang, my chest felt tight. The pistol in my hand seemed impossibly heavy. The old man spoke, his voice calm, measured. "You have good aim." I didn't reply. He stood, adjusting his jacket as though he hadn't just dodged death. "Do you know who I am?" "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "Good," he said with a nod. "But I know who you are, and I owe you my life." I didn't want his gratitude or anything else. I just wanted to vanish back into the quiet. But something told me that wasn't in the cards. When the cops arrived, I stayed put, the tool laid on the table, my hands resting beside it. The old man vouched for me, called it self-defense, praised me for saving lives. The officers let me off with a stern warning about vigilante justice. As I walked out of the cafe, his words echoed in my head. "I know who you are." He wasn't just talking about my name. He'd seen the soldier I thought I'd buried. The call came the next morning, interrupting my fragile peace. I almost ignored it, but something about the number felt different. "Mr. Foster?" The voice was calm and professional. "This is Chief Nathan Rhodes. I need you to come down to the station." It wasn't a request. Chief Rhodes's office defied expectations. Instead of the polished professionalism one might imagine for a senior officer, it was a cramped, disordered space. Papers were piled on every available surface, and a coffee mug, stained from years of use, sat prominently on the desk. Rhodes himself was a large man in his mid-50s, his rugged features and weary eyes suggesting he had seen more than his share of hard times. The meeting began with little fanfare. Rhodes revealed the identity of the man whose life had been saved during the cafe shootout, Victor Rhodes. That name carried weight. Known as one of the most elusive and powerful mob bosses in the country, Victor was a figure both feared and whispered about among law enforcement. His operations were nearly untouchable, protected by disappearing evidence, terrified witnesses, and juries unwilling to convict. What followed was an unexpected twist. Victor Rhodes was Nathan Rhodes's brother, a fact that explained the complexity of the situation. The two had been estranged for years, their relationship fractured by their opposing paths. While Nathan had dedicated his career to upholding the law, Victor had mastered the art of evading it. For Nathan, every attempt to bring his brother to justice, had been met with frustration and failure. The events at the cafe had shifted the balance. By saving Victor, a man known for his strict code of loyalty, the situation had been altered. Victor would see this as a debt that needed repaying, and Nathan knew his brother's methods well enough to predict what would come next. Victor would likely attempt to reward his rescuer, be it through money, influence, or even an invitation to join his criminal enterprise. Nathan, understanding the dangers of Victor's attention, presented an alternative, an offer to join the police force. With training as a soldier and an instinct for handling high-pressure situations, there was no denying that the skills were there. Nathan saw an opportunity to channel those abilities into a purpose while also offering protection against the potential consequences of Victor's gratitude. Rejecting Victor outright could provoke a more dangerous response. Aligning with the police provided allies and resources to counter the looming threat. The proposition, however, wasn't a simple one. Joining the police meant stepping into a new battle, one that might feel as endless and morally gray as the ones left behind. It also required making a choice about values and allegiances. Accepting meant entering Nathan's world and the war he waged against his brother. Refusing meant standing alone, vulnerable to the unpredictable force that Victor represented. Leaving the office, the weight of the situation hung heavily. The streets, once ordinary, now seemed charged with unseen danger and consequence. The path forward was unclear, but one thing was certain: life had irrevocably changed. Later that evening, the expected knock came. On the doorstep stood Victor Rhodes, every bit the image of calm authority. His sharp suit and composed demeanor contrasted starkly with the rustic simplicity of the porch. Beside him was a younger man, his son Alistair, whose sharp features and piercing gaze mirrored his father's. Alistair carried a leather bag, casual in his posture but unmistakably deliberate in intent. Inside, the visit played out with calculated precision. Victor acknowledged the earlier meeting with Nathan, dismissing it as misguided and emphasizing his own perspective. He viewed the rescue at the cafe not as a random event, but as a pivotal moment, an act that bound the two men in an unspoken contract. To Victor, loyalty was paramount, and debts were not left unpaid. Alistair opened the bag, revealing a substantial sum of cash, an offer designed to entice and impress. It wasn't framed as a bribe, but rather an opportunity, a chance to align with a system that Victor described as more honest and loyal than the institutions represented by Nathan. For Victor, the concept of family was central, and he extended the notion to include those who chose to stand with him. Despite the allure of the offer, it was rejected. The decision had already been made to align with Nathan, despite the flaws and compromises inherent in law enforcement. Victor's philosophy of power and loyalty held no appeal. While Nathan's world was imperfect, it at least represented an effort to pursue justice, however flawed. Victor accepted the decision with a calculated calm, though the underlying tension was palpable. His parting words carried a warning. Choosing sides in this conflict meant commitment, and there would be no easy retreat. As Victor and Alistair left, the air felt heavier, the stakes higher. The quiet life that had been built in the hills, far from the chaos of war and the noise of the city, was gone. What lay ahead was uncertain, but the simple days of solitude and anonymity had come to an end. The room was still for a moment before Victor rose to his feet, his movements deliberate and composed. He adjusted his jacket with a precision that hinted at years of practice, his expression calm but intense. His words carried a note of admiration as he acknowledged the courage it must have taken to make such a stand. He valued bravery, he said, above all else, and he made it clear that my actions at the cafe hadn't gone unnoticed. He extended his hand, a gesture that felt less like reconciliation and more like an invitation. I hesitated, then accepted. His grip was firm, unyielding, as if testing my resolve. Victor left an open-ended offer. If I ever needed him, real help, as he put it, I would know where to find him. It wasn't just an offer, it was a statement, a declaration that our paths might cross again. Alistair followed his father's lead, stepping forward to shake my hand. His demeanor was warmer, more approachable, and his words carried a strange kind of respect for my decision. He called me a man with the heart of a brother, even if our allegiances didn't align. There was no disappointment in his tone as he zipped the leather bag shut, the rejection of their offer seemingly treated as just another move in the intricate game they played. Victor paused at the door before leaving, casting one last look over his shoulder. He left me with parting words that felt like both a compliment and a warning. Men like me, he said, were needed in this world regardless of which side we chose. Then the door closed behind them, leaving me alone in the stillness of my house. I stayed in place for a long time, staring at the empty spot where the bag of cash had rested. The sheer weight of the offer, $250,000, lingered in my mind. It could have changed everything, brought a kind of comfort and security I hadn't known in years, but it wouldn't have bought back my integrity. That much was clear. Victor and Alistair had been sincere in their own way. I didn't doubt that. Yet loyalty to their world came with a cost I wasn't willing to pay. I had drawn my line in the sand, and I knew it would take everything I had to keep it. Pouring myself a glass of whiskey, I sat at the table, my thoughts heavy with the realization that the conflict wasn't over. It had only shifted to a new battlefield. Adjusting to life on the police force was no small feat. Trading my military fatigues for a badge felt strange at first, but the stakes were just as high, even if the rhythm of the work was different. Every shift brought new challenges and split-second decisions. But I wasn't in it for the rush. I was searching for something more, a sense of purpose, perhaps even redemption. One rainy evening, a call came in just as I was finishing my shift. A car had skidded off the road, careened down an embankment, and crashed into a tree. When I arrived at the scene, the rain was relentless, soaking the muddy roadside and turning it into a mess. The vehicle was crumpled beyond recognition, its hood folded in like an accordion. Inside, I found a woman, unconscious but alive, her face streaked with crimson from a deep cut on her forehead. I worked quickly to free her from the wreckage, keeping my voice calm despite the chaos. She stirred as I pulled her free, her groans of pain turning into faint awareness. Even in that moment, her strength shone through, soft features framed by long dark hair, with a quiet resilience that struck me. Paramedics arrived just as I managed to get her out of the car. They whisked her to the hospital while I followed, ensuring her paperwork was in order and checking that she was stable. It wasn't standard procedure, but something about her stayed with me. When I visited her hospital room the next day, she was awake, her bandaged head resting on the pillow. She offered me a weak but genuine smile, thanking me for saving her life. Her name was Lily Carter. As we exchanged a few words, I felt a pull I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of connection that caught me off guard. After she was discharged, I stopped by her house to check in. She seemed surprised, but grateful for the gesture. We talked for a while, and before I realized it, I found myself asking if she'd like to grab coffee sometime. She hesitated briefly before agreeing, her smile making the moment feel light and unforced. What began as one coffee turned into something more. Days blended into weeks marked by late-night conversations, shared meals, and laughter that made the weight of the world seem a little easier to carry. Lily had a way of bringing warmth into the quiet spaces of my life, filling the once empty house with light and noise. A few months later, she moved in. It wasn't planned. It just happened naturally, the way most good things do. We'd spend our evenings on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder, talking about everything and nothing. She asked about my time in the army, about the scars I carried, both visible and invisible. I didn't share everything, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could. One afternoon at the precinct, the intercom crackled, summoning me to Nathan Rhodes's office. His voice carried a tone of urgency that made my stomach tighten. I knocked and stepped inside, closing the door behind me. Nathan wasted no time. He acknowledged my good work on the force before shifting the conversation to something personal. His question blindsided me. Why was I living with Lily Carter? He wasn't asking out of curiosity. His tone was heavy, almost cautionary. When I explained that I cared about her, he pressed further, revealing a truth that hit like a punch to the gut. Lily Carter wasn't who she seemed. Her real name was Lily Rhodes. She was Victor's daughter. The revelation felt like a bomb detonating, leaving me reeling in its aftermath. I struggled to process it, my mind racing with questions. This wasn't just personal. It was the collision of two worlds I had fought to keep separate. And it was only the beginning. Nathan leaned in, his gaze piercing as he laid it all out. Victor Rhodes wasn't just Lily's father. He was a shadow she'd been running from her entire life. She'd taken her mother's last name to distance herself from the infamy, to carve out a separate identity. But despite her efforts, the truth remained. She was his daughter. The revelation left me reeling as I left Nathan's office. By the time I got home, my thoughts were a chaotic whirlwind of questions and doubts. When I walked in, Lily was in the kitchen, humming softly while she prepared dinner. She turned to greet me with a smile, but something inside me had shifted. I couldn't hold back. My words came out sharp and demanding as I confronted her about the truth Nathan had revealed. Her expression froze, the color draining from her face. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, but then her shoulders slumped, and she met my eyes with a mix of guilt and resignation. She admitted she'd planned to tell me, but fear had held her back. Things between us had grown serious, and she'd worried that revealing her connection to Victor would destroy everything we'd built. Her voice shook as she explained how much she hated the life she'd left behind. Growing up in Victor Rhodes's house had been suffocating, watching her father's manipulations, seeing her brother idolize him. The moment she turned 18, she walked away and never looked back. Lily's pain was palpable as she described the weight of her past. She'd chosen her mother's name because she didn't want to be defined by her father's legacy. She wanted to be her own person, free of the Rhodes name. Sitting across from her at the kitchen table, I felt my anger start to dissolve. Her words, her expression, her vulnerability, they all spoke of someone who had fought to escape a darkness she didn't choose. But trust isn't easily rebuilt. I told her that withholding the truth had hurt me, that she should have believed I'd stand by her no matter what. She apologized, tears brimming in her eyes, and I could see how deeply she regretted the deception. In the months that followed, we worked to heal the cracks her secrecy had caused. Lily proved time and again that she was nothing like her father. Her strength, her determination to live a life of integrity, and the love we shared made it clear that she was fighting her own battle, and winning. Loving her became not just something I did, but something that felt essential, as natural as breathing. 6 months later, surrounded by a small circle of family and friends, we exchanged vows. Nathan stood among the guests, a quiet but supportive presence. When Lily said "I do," it was more than a promise. It was her declaration of independence from her past and commitment to the future we were building together. For the first time in years, I felt like I'd found where I belonged. But life on the force left little room for complacency. The unpredictable chaos of the job hit hard and fast, with no time to second-guess or hesitate. Maybe it was the discipline ingrained in me during my time in the military, or maybe it was just my nature, but I became the one they called when situations spiraled out of control. The challenges came relentlessly. Every call brought its own risks, its own echoes of my time in Afghanistan. But instead of enemy fighters, I now faced armed robbers, gang members, or people pushed to the edge of desperation. Instead of brothers in arms, I had fellow officers depending on me to keep them safe. One night, we got word of a hostage situation at a convenience store. A man, strung out and armed, had taken 3 people captive. When I arrived, the scene was already tense, with squad cars lining the street and a crowd of panicked bystanders gathering nearby. Carrying a protective shield, I approached the store carefully, my mind calculating every angle, every potential outcome. Through the glass door, I could see him pacing, the object in his hand erratic but dangerous. I kept my voice steady, projecting calm as I talked him down. The minutes dragged on, every word chosen carefully to de-escalate the situation. Eventually, he lowered the object, allowing the hostages to escape. I secured it and took him into custody, grateful that the situation had ended without harm. Not every day on the job ended so cleanly. Some situations called for action before words. One call brought us to a house where a man with a history of violence had barricaded himself inside with his family. When negotiations failed, we breached the door. He came at us with a knife, his eyes wild with rage. Instinct kicked in. I disarmed him and brought him down before anyone could be hurt. The relief on his wife's and children's faces made the adrenaline surge worth it. Every day was a test, and every night I carried the weight of what I'd seen and done. But at the end of the day, I returned home to Lily, to the life we were building together. She was my anchor, the one who reminded me that even in a world filled with chaos and darkness, there was still a place for love and light. Word of my work spread quickly. Officers began looking my way whenever things spiraled out of control, trusting me to steady the chaos. It wasn't something I sought, but I couldn't ignore the responsibility either. Civilians started recognizing me, too. A mother would thank me for saving her child, or a shop owner would shake my hand after I stopped a robbery. Their gratitude reminded me of why I chose this path. It was about making a difference, about standing firm when others couldn't. But the weight of it all wasn't easy to carry. There were nights when I'd come home with sore knuckles and a mind that wouldn't quiet. The memories of the day playing on a loop. Those nights, Lily would be waiting for me. She never pressed for answers or demanded explanations. She just sat with me, her quiet presence a reminder that I wasn't alone. The job was never going to be easy, but I wasn't chasing ease. I was searching for purpose, a way to transform my past into something meaningful. Every time I stepped into a volatile situation and helped someone make it out alive, I felt like I was doing just that, drawing a line between chaos and order and standing firm when no one else could. When Lily told me she was pregnant, it felt like the ground shifted beneath me. In a life filled with conflict and rebuilding, I hadn't imagined this moment. The thought of becoming a father brought equal parts excitement and fear. The months that followed tested me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Lily's moods were unpredictable, swinging like a pendulum from radiant joy to stormy frustration. One moment, she'd cradle her growing belly and talk about baby names with a glowing smile. The next, she'd be upset over something trivial, like my forgetting to take out the trash. At first, I tried to reason with her, to offer explanations, but that only made things worse. I quickly learned to let her vent without taking it personally. Some nights, I'd find her on the couch crying over a commercial or a sentimental movie scene. I'd sit beside her, holding her hand and reassuring her that everything would be fine. Other nights, her frustration would erupt, and she'd accuse me of being distant or unresponsive. One evening, after I came home late from a long shift, her frustration boiled over. "You don't care, do you?" she snapped, her voice sharp with emotion. "I care more than you know," I replied, keeping my voice calm despite the exhaustion weighing me down. "I'm doing my best, for you and for the baby." Her glare softened, and tears welled in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. I feel like I'm losing my mind." I pulled her into my arms and kissed her forehead. "You're not," I said gently. "You're carrying our entire world inside you." As her pregnancy progressed, I became an expert at balancing the demands of work and home. Violent calls and tense negotiations at work were followed by assembling cribs and making late-night snack runs. It was exhausting, but it was worth it. This was my family, and I was determined to show up for them. The night Lily went into labor, I had just finished a double shift. My feet were aching, and my mind felt like it was moving through fog. But the moment I saw her clutching her belly, everything snapped into focus. "It's time," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. I grabbed the hospital bag we'd packed weeks ago and helped her to the car. The drive was a blur, part urgency, part surreal disbelief. At the hospital, the controlled chaos of doctors and nurses felt familiar, almost like stepping into another battlefield. But this time, the stakes were personal. Lily clung to my hand, her grip unrelenting as contractions came in waves. Hours passed, each one dragging longer than the last. She cried, screamed, and cursed, her strength on full display. I stayed at her side, wiping her forehead and whispering encouragement, even as she crushed my fingers in hers. Finally, the room was filled with the sound of a newborn's cry, a sound that shattered the tension like a wave breaking on the shore. The doctor held up our baby, a tiny, wriggling bundle, and announced that it was a girl before placing her on Lily's chest. Lily's exhaustion melted into pure joy as she cradled our daughter, her tears a mix of relief and love. "Do you want to hold her?" Lily asked, her voice soft and full of wonder. I hesitated, the weight of everything catching up to me. "Not yet," I said quietly. "Maybe later." Lily seemed surprised, but didn't dwell on it. A few days later, we brought the baby home. My father, Mike, was waiting for us, eager to meet his granddaughter. He held her with a tenderness I rarely saw, but his expression grew thoughtful as he handed her back to Lily. Then he pulled me aside. "She's beautiful," he said softly, but there was a question in his tone. One I'd been asking myself since the moment I saw her. Without answering, I motioned for him to follow me into the hallway. Once we were out of earshot, I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms. "I've been wondering the same thing," I admitted. "Ever since she told me she was pregnant, I've had my doubts, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything, not until I knew for sure." Mike's brow furrowed. "And now?" he asked, his voice cautious. I glanced out the window, my thoughts a tangled mess. "The timing doesn't add up perfectly," I admitted. "And when I look at her, there are things that don't feel right, but I can't accuse Lily of anything without proof. I trusted her, and I need to figure out what's real before I tear this family apart." Mike nodded, his concern evident, but his support unwavering. "Whatever you decide, you won't face it alone." As I stood there, staring out at the empty parking lot, I felt the weight of the decision ahead. The chaos I'd faced on the streets had nothing on the storm brewing within my own home. Mike's expression shifted between concern and cautious understanding as he studied me. "And what about Lily? Has she said or done anything to make you suspect?" I shook my head firmly. "No, she's been acting like everything's fine. But If there's something she's hiding, I'll figure it out. My gut's telling me not to ignore this, but I need to tread carefully. If I confront her without evidence, it could backfire, and I'm not about to walk away from this little girl without knowing the truth. Mike's gaze lingered on me, softening as he nodded slowly. You're handling this better than most men would, Butch. A lot of people would have lost their heads by now. A bitter smirk tugged at my lips. Keeping calm doesn't mean I'm not furious, Dad. If she's betrayed me, it cuts deep. But I've learned to wait for the right moment before acting. Anger's useless without direction. He reached out and placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. You deserve answers, son. Whatever they turn out to be, I know you'll handle it. You always do. I nodded, my jaw tightening. I will. One way or another, I'll get to the bottom of this. When I walked back into the room, Lily stirred in the bed, her tired eyes lighting up as she smiled at me. I forced a smile back, burying the storm of emotions threatening to surface. For now, I needed to keep up appearances. Whatever lay ahead, I owed it to myself and my daughter to uncover the truth. Later, I stood in Nathan's dimly lit office, the weight of my suspicions pressing down as I explained the situation. Each word was heavy, bitter as I recounted the details. This wasn't just about Lily or the baby. This was about trust and whether mine had been misplaced. Nathan listened silently, his eyes sharp and thoughtful, nodding occasionally as I spoke. When I finally stopped, the silence stretched before he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. You're sure about this? He asked, his voice low and even. I don't want to be, I admitted, my teeth clenched. But the signs are there. I can't ignore them. I need to know the truth, for my own sanity and for that little girl. Nathan sighed, running a hand down his face. All right, but we're doing this the right way. No shortcuts, no bending the rules. If Lily's hiding something, we'll find out. But we don't cross any lines. Agreed? I nodded firmly. Agreed. Within the hour, Nathan had pulled together a team. First was Selena Diaz, a no-nonsense detective whose sharp instincts were matched by her military precision. She strode into the room with confidence, giving me a curt nod. You've got my help, she said simply. Next was Brian, the department's tech guru. Nervous but brilliant, he was the kind of guy who could turn a digital breadcrumb into a trail. We'll keep it clean, he assured me, adjusting his glasses. No way she'll know we're watching. Two plainclothes officers, Reed and Carmichael, rounded out the team. Their task was straightforward: monitor Lily's movements from a distance and report back. That night, while Lily slept, I installed the surveillance equipment. A tiny camera in the living room, one in the kitchen, a recorder under her car's dashboard, and a tracker on her phone, all feeding into Brian's secure system. Each step felt like a betrayal, but the alternative, living in the dark, was worse. The following morning, we gathered in a small precinct conference room. Nathan stood at the head of the table, his tone serious as he laid out the plan. This isn't a typical investigation, he began. Butch needs clarity, and we're going to provide it. Selena, you'll coordinate the team. Brian, monitor the feeds and flag anything unusual. Reed and Carmichael, stay invisible on foot surveillance. Butch, stay out of it until we have something concrete. Understood, I said, though every instinct screamed against taking a back seat. Nathan added, Butch, get a DNA sample from the baby. That's non-negotiable. I nodded, suppressing the tight knot forming in my chest. For days, I went through the motions, splitting my time between work and home, pretending nothing had changed. Lily's routines seemed unremarkable. Shopping, park visits, errands. But every time she smiled or laughed, doubt clawed at me. Was it genuine, or was she hiding something? It wasn't until Brian called me one afternoon that the facade began to crack. His voice was tense as he told me to get to the precinct immediately. When I arrived, he was hunched over his laptop, Selena and Nathan standing behind him. What do you have? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Brian hit play on a video from the living room feed. Lily was on the phone, her tone low but distinct. She looks just like you, dear, she said, pausing before adding, No, Butch has no idea. He's clueless. My fists clenched as I stared at the screen. Who was she talking to? I demanded. Brian shook his head. The number belongs to someone named Alex Brown. It's flagged in our system, but we're still digging. Nathan's expression hardened. This isn't proof yet, but it's a start. I nodded, forcing myself to stay calm. Keep looking. I need to know everything. The resolve inside me solidified as I left the room. If there was any betrayal, any deceit, I'd find it, even if it meant unraveling everything I thought I knew. A few days later, Brian's grim expression told me he had found something. Without a word, he opened his laptop and gestured for me to sit. The screen glowed in the dim office light, and his voice was heavy as he began. "This won't be easy to hear." Bracing myself, I leaned in, ready to face whatever truth was about to come. Brian began methodically, his tone professional, but heavy with the weight of what he was about to reveal. I dug into everything: locations, CCTV records, emails, texts, and cross-referenced it with Alex Brown's known activities. There's no way around it, Butch. They've been meeting for 2 years. The number hit me harder than any blow I'd taken in my life. 2 years. My mind raced, unraveling every moment of those years. Every change in Lily's behavior I'd brushed off. The occasional late nights, the vague excuses, all of it now painted a picture I didn't want to see. Brian's voice continued, detached but deliberate, like he was reading from a report. It wasn't a relationship in the emotional sense. From what I've seen, it was purely physical. Their texts confirmed that. Explicit messages arranging hotel meetups, sometimes at his apartment. No signs of emotional involvement, just transactions. I clenched my jaw, the betrayal sinking deeper with every word. I forced myself to stay composed, though my fists tightened until my knuckles turned white. The rage simmered just below the surface, threatening to boil over, but this wasn't the time. "She didn't talk about you much," Brian added hesitantly, like it might offer some strange comfort. "This wasn't about replacing you. It was something else entirely." The words stung, even if they weren't surprising. I leaned back in my chair, my chest tight with anger and disbelief. 2 years of lies, I said quietly, the weight of it pressing down like a heavy chain. "Where?" I finally asked, my voice low and strained. Brian clicked through his laptop, pulling up grainy surveillance footage and a map. Hotels mostly, a couple of times at his apartment. She was careful, always during work hours, always out of town. She made sure it wouldn't raise suspicion. I watched the footage without blinking. There she was, walking into a hotel lobby like she had nothing to hide, her face calm and composed. It was a stark contrast to the turmoil unraveling inside me. Brian slid a USB drive across the table. "There's an audio recording on here," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "You'll want to hear it." I took the drive and left without another word, my mind reeling. Once home, I parked in the driveway and locked myself in the truck, slipping the drive into the small player I kept for work. My hands trembled as I pressed play. The audio crackled before her voice came through, unmistakable and sharp in my ears. Lily's voice, soft, familiar, the same one that had once whispered promises of love and forever to me. "He's completely clueless," she said, a laugh following her words. The sound was like a blade cutting through me. Another voice joined hers. Alex's. It was low, smug, and casual. "You're sure? The guy's a cop, not stupid." She laughed again, each sound twisting the knife. "He's not stupid, just trusting, too trusting. He wants to believe in me, and I let him." My stomach turned as Alex chuckled. "You're good at that. Always have been." There was a pause, the faint clink of glasses in the background. I imagined them sitting together, relaxed, their words dismantling the life I thought I'd built. "Do you ever feel bad?" Alex asked, his tone almost mocking. "Watching him believe the baby's his? Letting him play house?" Lily's voice dropped, each word heavier than the last. "Not really. He's sweet, but it's just easier this way. He's stable, safe." That word, safe, echoed in my head, bitter and cruel. Alex laughed again, more amused than before. "Safe, huh? And he's going to raise our kid. Talk about the ultimate win." Lily's reply was lighter, almost dismissive. "It's not a win. It's just practical. You don't want to be tied down, and I don't want the drama. This way, everyone's happy." "Everyone," Alex teased, the mocking edge in his tone clear. She laughed softly. "Okay, maybe not everyone. But it works, doesn't it?" The recording ended with static, but their laughter lingered long after. I sat there in the silence of my truck, the weight of their words crashing over me. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until I thought it might break. The next day, I was in Nathan's office, surrounded by the team, Selena, Brian, Reed, and Carmichael. Nathan stood behind his desk, arms crossed, his expression unreadable as Brian presented the latest findings. "They're planning to meet tomorrow," Brian said, his voice heavy with tension. "At your house, Butch. Alex thinks you'll be on patrol." The room was still as the words hung in the air. I felt a cold fury settle over me, my jaw clenched so tight it ached. At my house, I said quietly, the words bitter on my tongue. Brian nodded, his expression uneasy. She sent him a text. Everything's arranged. She's confident it's safe. That damned word again. Safe. My pulse pounded in my ears as anger surged, hot and uncontrollable. Nathan's voice cut through the haze. Butch, listen to me, he said firmly, his tone commanding my attention. We're handling this, but we're doing it the right way. No rash decisions, no heat-of-the-moment mistakes. You hear me? I nodded stiffly, though every fiber of my being screamed for action. Nathan turned to the team, laying out the plan. Brian, monitor all communications. Selena, coordinate surveillance. Reed and Carmichael, stay out of sight but close enough to move if needed. Butch, you're staying back until we have what we need. No exceptions. I nodded again, though it took everything in me to keep quiet. Nathan's gaze softened, his tone firm but supportive. You're not alone in this, Butch. We'll make sure they regret every second of thinking they could get away with this. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I simply nodded. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation they didn't see coming. They thought they could turn my home into their playground. They thought wrong. The day had come. The alert from Brian pinged on my phone. Alex Brown had entered my house. Surveillance footage confirmed what I already feared. Lily greeted him at the door in black lingerie, her demeanor calm, her actions deliberate. The sight of their embrace on the screen, his hands on her kiss on his lips, ignited a fury that had been simmering for weeks. As I parked outside the house, my heart hammered, not with fear, but with a cold, calculated rage. I entered the home without a sound, the door swinging open with a quiet finality. Voices drifted from upstairs, muffled laughter and whispers coming from our bedroom. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, my pulse steady but my resolve hardening. The scene that greeted me when I opened the door was worse than I had imagined. There they were, entangled on the bed, utterly oblivious. My bed, my sanctuary. It took less than a second for the dam inside me to burst. Before Alex had time to react, I lunged, my fist colliding with his jaw in a sickening crunch. He stumbled back, dazed, but I didn't stop. Months of betrayal and humiliation poured out with every punch, every strike landing with a force I didn't know I possessed. He tried to shield himself, sputtering protests, but I wouldn't give him the chance. You think you can walk into my house, and do this? My voice echoed through the room as I grabbed him by the collar, slamming him into the dresser. A red streak appeared beneath his nose, and the smugness in his expression dissolved into pure terror. Pulling out my cuffs, I growled, "You're under arrest, trespassing, indecent conduct. Take your pick." Behind me, Lily scrambled off the bed, clutching the sheet to her chest. "Butch, stop! Please, it's not what you think!" Her voice was high-pitched, panicked, but I didn't turn to face her. "It's exactly what I think," I spat, my voice low and venomous. "Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." Before she could respond, Selena appeared in the doorway, her arrival as abrupt as a storm breaking. She assessed the scene with a cool, razor-sharp gaze, then walked straight to Lily. Without a word, her hand struck Lily's face with a sharp crack, sending her sprawling to the floor. "Enough," Selena said, her tone cold and unyielding. She pointed at Lily, who stared up at her in shock. "You're going to cooperate, and you're going to file charges against him, now." Lily shook her head, trembling. "I can't," she whispered. Selena's eyes narrowed. "You will, or I'll make sure we find enough evidence to ruin your life in ways you can't even imagine. Am I clear?" Lily looked at me, her face pale, tears spilling freely. "I'm sorry," she murmured, the words barely audible. The chaos only intensified as the police arrived, the sound of sirens cutting through the air. Nathan walked in moments later, his presence steady and commanding. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood a woman I recognized from the files Brian had shown me earlier, Alex's wife, Becky. Becky's gaze swept over the scene, Alex bruised and restrained, Lily disheveled and wrapped in a sheet, and her face twisted with fury. Without hesitation, she charged at Alex, her fists flying. No one moved to stop her. Her strikes landed, each one fueled by betrayal and rage. Alex cowered, unable to defend himself. When she finally turned to Lily, her voice was venomous. "And you," she snarled, advancing on her. "You disgusting, pathetic homewrecker!" Becky struck Lily across the face, her nails clawing as she screamed obscenities. Lily collapsed to the floor, sobbing, trying to shield herself. Selena stood by, arms crossed, watching the spectacle with icy disdain. When Becky finally stepped back, breathing heavily, she turned to Alex with a look of finality. "We're done," she said. "Do you hear me? Done. And if you come near me or the kids again, I'll make sure you regret it." Nathan motioned for the officers to take Alex away. As they dragged him out the door, his head hung low. But I knew this wasn't the end of it. Not yet. Lily sat slumped against the wall, her face streaked with tears, trembling under the weight of everything that had just unfolded. I stared down at her, my expression cold and unyielding. Any warmth I'd once felt for her had been extinguished. "Get up," I said, my voice low but sharp enough to make her flinch. She looked up at me, her lips quivering. "Butch, please, Don't," I cut her off. "You don't get to explain. You don't get to justify this." I stepped closer, towering over her. "You're going to take the baby and leave tonight. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here. This house, it's mine. You have no place in it anymore." Her eyes widened, and she shook her head desperately. "Please, Butch, let me—" I leaned in, meeting her gaze with every ounce of the fury and betrayal I felt. "I'm filing for divorce, and if you even think about fighting me on it, remember this. I have everything. Every text, every email, every recording, and now this." Lily collapsed into sobs as I turned and walked away. The life I thought I had was gone, shattered by lies and betrayal. But as I stepped out of the house and into the cold night air, one thing was clear. I was done being played. The confrontation left the house in ruins, not physically, but emotionally. As I stood over Lily, her disheveled form huddled on the floor, I gestured broadly, my voice cold and precise. "Your affair with Alex, his wife exposing you, him being arrested in my house. It's all documented, every last detail." Her sobs grew louder, but I felt nothing. "You have a choice," I continued, unyielding. "Sign those divorce papers and leave quietly, or I'll make sure the world knows the truth. Every disgusting piece of it." She reached out, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake. Stop," I interrupted sharply, the words cutting through her excuses. "You don't get to play the victim. You chose this. You betrayed me, disgraced me, and tore apart everything we built. Now you can live with it." Her hand fell to her side, and she dissolved into tears, shoulders shaking with the weight of her defeat. I straightened, the decision made. Get out, tonight. That evening, the knock on the door came as a deliberate, steady rap. Opening it, I wasn't surprised to find Victor standing there. His presence was commanding as ever, though his expression carried a gravity I hadn't seen before. He stepped inside without waiting for permission, his sharp eyes scanning the room as though reconstructing the events that had unfolded there. Victor didn't speak until I sat down, lowering himself into the chair opposite me. For a long moment, he studied me, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I expected. "I know what happened," he began. "Lily, Alex." There was nothing to say, so I stayed silent. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly, his tone hardening as he continued. "I'm not here to make excuses for her. She made her choices and she'll have to live with them. But there's something you should know. When Lily left my world, it wasn't just because she wanted out. She was cast out." I tensed but didn't interrupt. His words came steady, each one heavy with implication. "She was involved with Alex even back then," he said. "I found out. Told her to end it. She refused. So I told her she was no longer welcome in my family." He let the silence linger before adding, "I didn't liquidate Alex then because of his kids, and I won't now for the same reason. But I'll make sure he leaves this city for good. His wife's already filed for divorce, and he'll hand over everything, his house, his money. If he doesn't, he'll regret it." Victor stood, smoothing his suit jacket as he prepared to leave. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something resembling regret cross his face. "I thought I raised her better," he said softly, "but maybe my sins caught up with me through her." Before leaving, he turned back, his sharp gaze meeting mine. "If you ever need anything, Butch, you know where to find me." And just like that, he was gone. 2 days later, the news came quietly. Alex had been released from custody. But by midday, rumors spread. A black van with tinted windows had picked him up outside the station. After that, Alex Brown disappeared without a trace. That evening, Becky called me. Her voice was shaky, almost disbelieving, as she told me that Alex had already signed the divorce papers. "The house, the accounts, it's all in my name now," she said. She paused, her tone breaking slightly. I don't know how, but I know this wasn't just him deciding to do the right thing. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. As for Lily and the baby, they vanished as though they'd never been. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence. A part of me had expected it, but the emptiness still lingered. I poured myself a drink that night, sitting alone in the house that had once been filled with memories. Now, it was quiet. Too quiet. The weight of it all pressed down on me as I let the night stretch endlessly. Nathan called me into his office the next day. His tone left no room for delay. When I stepped inside, I froze. Sitting across from Nathan, cradling Lily's baby in his arms, was Victor. His calm composure was unnerving, but it was the faint smile that unsettled me the most. Nathan gestured for me to close the door. I did, every muscle in my body taut with suspicion. "Lily's missing," Nathan said, his tone grim. "Victor's been looking for her, but there's no trace." I turned to Victor, my voice low but steady. "Is she alive?" Victor didn't flinch. Slowly, he stood, adjusting the baby in his arms. "File for divorce," he said simply. "Site abandonment. It will be finalized in a few years." Then he moved closer, his gaze softening as he looked at the child in his arms. When he spoke again, his voice carried an eerie finality. "This time, I won't make any mistakes." Without another word, he left, his presence lingering like a shadow. Days turned into weeks. Victor left the city, claiming he was stepping away from his business for good. Nathan didn't buy it, and neither did I. "Someone will fill the vacuum," Nathan said, his voice resigned. "It's just a matter of time. All we can do is make sure they're not as dangerous or as smart as Victor." His words settled like a grim reminder. The game didn't stop. It only shifted. Life moved on, though it felt like a different world entirely. The betrayal, the chaos, and the pain. It was all part of a past I couldn't escape, but I refused to let it define me. I stayed on the force, finding a new rhythm with the team I'd grown to trust. Selena, Brian, Nathan. They weren't just coworkers, they were family. We fought battles on and off the streets, but we had each other's backs no matter what. In the end, that's what mattered. Through all the mess, I found something solid, something real, and for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be,